Hi guys and girls and everyone between, welcome back to Black Wahala. And if this is your first time watching a video of mine, hello. Black Wahala is a space where we delve into Black diasporic history in music, TV, and culture. Today we will begin a new series titled, How Much Do You Know? This series will be delving into some histories of Black diasporic people around the world. I will be posting the shorter versions on YouTube and then the longer versions on my Patreon. So if you want an in-depth video, consider becoming a Patreon where you can watch a full version of this video. Our first country of interest is, drumroll please, Canada. So let's talk about slavery in Canada. In 1628, the Kirkes, following a quick voyage to England, had returned to capture Quebec. They then sold their slave, a child of possibly 6 or 7 years old, to a French clerk. The French clerk gave the boy to Guillaume Couillard. This child was the first recorded slave in New France from Madagascar, Olivier Lejeune. At that time, there was a growing demand for enslaved Black people as a source of labor to avoid paying costly European workers. Before there was Canada, there was New France. New France was the area colonized by the French in North America, and it consisted of 5 colonies at its peak in 1712. There was Canada, which was divided into the districts of Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal, Acadia in the northeast, Plaisance on the island of Newfoundland, and Louisiane. In the 17th century, colonizers in New France practiced chattel slavery. The first slaves in New France were indigenous peoples, a large percentage of whom came from the Pawnee Nation. Many were captured during wars and sold to other indigenous nations or to European traders. Some French colonists acquired enslaved Black people through private sales, and some received indigenous and African slaves as gifts from indigenous allies. Out of approximately 4,200 slaves in New France at the peak of slavery, about 2,700 were indigenous people who were enslaved until 1783, and at least 1,443 of them were Black people who were enslaved between the late 1600s to 1831. Indigenous people who were enslaved were often referred to as Pawnee at this time. Indigenous and African enslaved peoples were also often referred to as domestiques or servants. According to Maureen Elgersman, this smaller amount of enslaved peoples is attributed to an imbalance in the number of Black slave women in early Canada, rather than factors like climate and crop production, as other scholars have argued. Few slaves worked in the field, even though agricultural work was often emphasized in requests for African slaves. On the 13th of April 1709, Intendant Jacques Rodot passed a colonial law entitled Ordinance rendered on the subject of the Negroes and the Indians called Pawnee. This colonial law legalized the purchase and possession of slaves in New France and further solidified the practice of enslavement. It was the first official legislation on slavery in New France. Before this, there never was legislation regulating slavery, most likely because of the smaller amount of enslaved peoples in Canada. Black enslavement was reinforced by the next French king, King Louis XV, who made 2 proclamations about slavery in the 1720s and one more in 1745. When the British conquered New France in 1760, it was decided that the Negroes and Pawnee of both sexes shall remain in their quality of slaves in the possession of the French and Canadians to whom they belong. They shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or to sell them.
Now that they were in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Henry decided he felt a little better. The voyage across the Atlantic, the storms, the sickness, were beginning to fade like a bad dream. In the old country, Henry's family had been tenant farmers with no chance, as his mother said, of bettering themselves. Uncle Ned had emigrated to Upper Canada and sent back glowing reports. It's a free country, with good, cheap land where a man can work and get ahead. After much discussion, Henry and his parents had packed their few belongings, booked passage for Montreal, and sailed away with high hopes of a farm of their own and a new life in a new land.
After the British were defeated in the American Revolution, the number of enslaved Africans increased significantly. In order to encourage the migration of white settlers to the North, in 1790, the government passed the Imperial Statute of 1790, which allowed the United Empire Loyalists to bring in Negroes, household furniture, utensils of husbandry, or clothing duty-free. Notice how enslaved peoples were categorized with household utensils? There were around 3,000 enslaved men, women, and children of African descent brought into British North America. By the 1790s, the number of enslaved Black people in the Maritimes ranged from 1,200 to 2,000. There were approximately 300 in Lower Canada, which we now know as Quebec, and between 500 and 700 in Upper Canada, which we now know as Ontario. I just want to quickly note that while indentured servitude was practiced at this time, it is very different from slavery. Furthermore, many slaves who were freed often became indentured servants themselves. Slave ownership was a widespread practice in British North America, and people who enslaved Black people ranged from government officials to priests and nuns. Even indigenous people owned slaves. Some had a small number of slaves, while others had a camp of 20 or more slaves. For instance, Joseph Brant, a Mohawk military leader and political leader, had about 40 Black slaves at one point. Now, what often happens in Canadian scholarship in describing the treatment of slaves at this time is abysmal, in my opinion. Many attempt to claim that enslaved people weren't treated that poorly, and anyway, so I think you can see my problem with those kinds of statements. Not only does it depend on this idea of British justice that existed in Canadian society at that time, but it's just wrong. The treatment of enslaved people did vary, but it stands to say as a slave, you are not afforded personhood, you are not afforded subjectivity, you are property. It is dehumanizing and a benevolent colonial idea to be claiming that slavery in Canada wasn't all that bad, because some people may have not been treated that badly in comparison to those who were enslaved in the United States. Of course, many enslaved Black people in Upper Canada fled to free regions in the United States that had banned slavery, so Vermont in 1777 and New York in 1799. Some launched legal challenges against their owners to fight against their slave status and treatment. For example, women like Chloe Cooley fought against their masters. Often the story of Chloe Cooley is ignored for John Graham Simcoe, who is considered to be the one who had freed all the slaves. But Chloe Cooley was the woman that brought about anti-slavery legislation to Upper Canada. She was an enslaved woman in Upper Canada struggling against her master, and it led to the Act to limit slavery in Upper Canada in 1793. This was the first legislation in the British colonies to restrict the slave trade. The act recognized enslavement as a legal and socially accepted institution and prohibited the importation of new slaves into Upper Canada. Other ways Black people resisted including poisoning and everyday acts of resistance such as sucking of teeth, screaming, or a cut eye. Or there were people like Henry Lewis, a fugitive slave who fled Canadian slavery, who then wrote a letter to his former master. In his letter, he stated that he wanted his labor to benefit himself and did not want to remain enslaved anymore. Undoubtedly, enslaved Black people did resist. As I said earlier, the Act to Limit Slavery in Upper Canada received royal assent on July 9, 1793. This was the first piece of legislation passed in the British colonies to limit slavery. The Act did not abolish it or emancipate a single enslaved person. It instead placed limitations on enslavement. Importing enslaved people became illegal, and children born in 1793 were no longer slave property and would be free on their 25th birthday. Their children would also be born free, and a time frame was basically set in place to gradually end slavery. So during this period of abolition, there was a move to replace enslavement with indentureship to benefit the white slave owners and supposedly those who were enslaved. Don't know about that. Indentureship, like I mentioned earlier, meant that people once enslaved were paid for their labor, serving their former masters or other employers for a specific length of time before becoming free. Indentureship was a generally accepted practice across British North America. It was actually adopted by many slave owners to avoid further losses when their slaves ran away. On the 24th of August in 1834, anti-slavery legislation was introduced to Britain, and the Slavery Abolition Act abolished slavery throughout the British Empire. This included British North America. So, I decided to make this video because somebody commented on one of my videos that I should only talk about things I know and I should stop talking about things I had no idea about. I actually wanted to do a bunch of series on my channel and move towards more historical content for a while now, and I finally decided to get it together. And I also just remember being a young kid in elementary school. We didn't even actually learn it. I would say it wasn't until high school that we learned about slavery. And in high school, we didn't even learn about slavery in Canada. We learned about slavery in the United States. And we also only talked about the Underground Railroad when it came to slavery in Canada. And to me, that is deliberate. It's the state attempting to erase this history. And in all honesty, in my opinion, if you want to figure out the problems Canada has with anti-Blackness, let's think about the way Canadians may or may not even know about slavery in Canada. Let's talk about the mere fact that slavery in Canada is not even in the curriculum for many provinces. I don't know about other provinces. I just know that the province I grew up in, we did not have to learn it. So yeah. If you want to know more about anti-Blackness in Canada, let's talk about the way Black Canadian history is often erased by the state. So, thank you for watching. If you are interested in content that delves into Black diasporic history, then this is the channel for you, and you should consider subscribing. Also, think about following me on Twitter and Instagram at Black Wahala. If you like the video, please give this video a thumbs up and share this video with others. Look forward to my next video in this series. Thank you for watching one more time, and bye!